Okay, so bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde. Welcome and welcome back on behalf of the Fourth Space team to Research in Conversation in the Faculty of Arts and Science. We are coming to you live from Concordia University's Fourth Space, which is located on unceded indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke. As caretakers for the lands and waters we are meeting on today, we are grateful to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation for their teachings about the earth and our relations. At Fourth Space, if you're unfamiliar with us, we collaborate with our university community to connect people to the diverse initiatives, research projects, and dialogues in development. So it's our great pleasure to have the opportunity to welcome in arts and science researchers into Fourth Space this week so that we might learn more about their ongoing projects. I'll just quickly mention that we are live streaming this to YouTube, and for those of you who are joining us via Zoom, welcome. You're more than welcome to jump in with some questions towards the end of each conversation if time allows. And for those of you who are joining us in the space, if you'd like to make any comments or questions, just please raise a hand and we'll get a microphone to you so that we can hear you on the recording and in the Zoom. Okay, so without further ado, it's my pleasure now to pass the floor over to Associate Dean of Research, Patrick Leroux. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone for being here. So this is day 4 of a marathon, what has turned out to be a marathon, an extraordinary marathon of actual conversations. I'm thinking in French, aller à la rencontre. We're actually meeting, talking about our research, and I'm really pleased to have Liz Miller, Sylvain David, and Norm Ravvin with us today. The idea, it's interesting because obviously we put a lot of thought into who we would invite. We wanted a mixture of early career, mid-career, late career, various disciplines, men, women, like all of that, all of that was taken into consideration. And I wanted to have a few thematic roundtable discussions as well. And Rebecca Ackman, who's done so much legwork for this, thank you, Rebecca, who's prepared notes for me, countless pages of background information on all 17 researchers, and then boiled it down to a page for each of you. Thank you again. She and I were discussing, what did it mean to have a thematic exchange here? And what was interesting in each of your profiles was the fact that you are both academics and creative types. So you are creating films, you're creating writing novels, writing short stories as well. And I'd be curious to hear over the course of this conversation how you navigate these waters. How can one be an academic and a creator without necessarily fitting into that research creation category that the funding bodies really like us to conform to, or perhaps we do actually fit in that category. So we'll talk about that in a moment. First, I'd like to present you. Many of your fans are in the audience, so they know you. But I'll nonetheless give a quick biographical sketch for those who don't. So I'll start with Liz Miller. Liz is a full professor in the Department of Communication Studies, promoted in 2016. She's internationally renowned documentary media maker with a 20-year history of creative practice and media activism. With a bit of background music I hear to accompany this description. Liz, you've done documentaries on refugee youth, impacts of the current climate crisis. You emphasize collaborative co-creation with communities, and I'd like us to talk about that in a moment. And you're also currently the co-director of the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. You arrived at Concordia in 2004, so not quite 20 years, but almost there. You'll get a pen. I hear 20 years. You've published a book, Going Public, The Art of Participatory Practice, with colleagues Edward Little and Steve High, 10 book chapters, many journal articles. I could go on, and I've got an extensive list here, and Maybe I could mention a few recent VR and interactive documentaries, and you can elaborate on those a bit later as well. Wastegapes, augmented tour and website with MJ Thompson, a colleague at FOFA. Moles, augmented reality again, mediation on memories, moles and aging. So moles as in the physical moles, not the animal. Swampscapes, another VR project, the shoreline, going public as I mentioned earlier. Thank you and welcome here today, Liz. Sylvain David, full professor in the Department d'Études Françaises, promoted in 2016, where he teaches 20th century and contemporary literature, because we are in the 21st century, of course. A member of Figura, the Centre de Recherche sur le Texte et l'Imaginaire, and a member of le Centre de Recherche Interuniversitaire en Sociocritique des Textes, or as the acronym suggests, CRIST. So Sylvain's work focuses on the imaginary of after the French novel and essays since the post-war period, on media culture, television, cinema, the internet, and on the punk movement as an aesthetic and an ethic, and perhaps even an ethos, as we'll see in some of the fictional work. Educated at UQAM, Université de Montréal, then UQAM, and having done a stage d'études, so 1 year in Paris at the Université de Paris, Sorbonne, where we met, actually. And we're surprised to discover each other's presence when we first walked into a department meeting. Yeah, life is funny that way sometimes. He's the author of an important study on Cioran, un héroïsme à rebours. Yeah, we might talk about Cioran a bit. I can see the links with the punk movement. Author of 2 novels, Faire Violence in 2013, and the most recent, Requiem en punk mineur, which we can see here demonstrated. Thank you. He's also co-edited 16 collections of works on academic works, 44 articles, 27 book chapters, so, and regular contributor for L'Inconvénient, so more essayistic writing. So very impressive profile. And what impressed me the most is that he used to be a guitarist for the punk band Banlieue Rouge that I listened to when I was an angry young man way back when. And I'm sure this will be discussed as we talk about the most recent book. Norm Ravvin, full professor in the Department of Religions and Cultures, a writer of fiction and criticism, whose work focuses on Canadian Jewish studies, Holocaust studies, memoir, and creative writing, but outside of the creative writing department. So we can talk about that also. How does one navigate all that? Jewish Eastern Europe, especially Poland, as we've seen in your last book and the forthcoming book, if I'm not mistaken. Immigration and travelogues. Norm is a member of CIS, the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies in Society and Culture. And interestingly, we can find out a lot about Norm on your personal website, a bit less on the Concordia website. And I found that interesting as well. Like there are two Norms. Yeah, Dr. Norm and Norm the writer. Norm has been at Concordia since 1999, so you're past, you've got your pen already.
It's an envelope opener.
Okay, an envelope opener, okay. Great, classy.
Yep.
Great. You've published 5 books, most recently The Girl Who Stole Everything, which I have a copy of here, with Linda Leith, publisher. 4 edited volumes, including Canadian short stories. You've written on Mordecai Richler, 8 anthologies, 14 publications in journals, an important collection of essays on Canadian and American Jewish literature in a book called House of Words, Jewish Identity and Memory, which I think you brought in today. And a forthcoming book, Who Gets In? An Immigration Story. So I'll be very, very curious and happy to hear you speak about that. So there are four of us, and three of you who are being asked questions and asked to engage. How about I'll ask questions, and you don't necessarily have to all answer the question, but if you want to, please feel free. Let's start with something relatively easy, or maybe not. How do you balance the academic and creative lives that you're engaged in? Is it really a balancing act? Do you keep things separately? How does it infuse, what one aspect infuse the other? So that was three questions, I'm sorry. Who would like to start? Sylvain? Norm?
Because I'm holding this?
Go ahead.
I think in my case, unpredictably, and it will sometimes, I guess, follow goals because of a particular project, but then very often that project might have to be put aside because the activities at the university change your timeline. So sometimes that feels hurtful, but then often you find that when the thing gets put aside and you come back to it many months later, that's actually not a bad thing. So in my case, the movement between creative work and more straightforwardly academic work, it's more like that kind of shuffling activity, I would say. That would be the balancing act. Yeah.
Right. And we mentioned earlier, or I mentioned earlier, that you have your professional website as a writer, but you also have your university institutional presence. Could you talk about that? Why that distinction?
Well, I'm holding on to something from my youth, I guess, and it has to do with the formative years when I was deciding, would I be a writer, would I be an academic, and in what way would these two things in some ways run as parallel lines? And I've never let go of it, so you're right to read the writer website in the fashion that you have, that it's performing a very specific function, and the work and the life there is not inclusive of the academic work. So somehow I've insisted to myself, no one's agreed with this or played along, but the parallel lines are in some ways going to be maintained till I stop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe a quick follow-up question, and we'll
yes.
Has your creative work been presented to and considered by your peers, for instance, for performance review, for instance, when you're applying for promotion?
Well, that was so important when I arrived, and it played a role, of course, in the hire. The idea was, here's a career that's operating in this way. Is this going to be acceptable and appropriate? And the department that I found myself in was entirely open and agreeable.
Great.
So no
So
problems to report on that front. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Norm. Sylvain or Liz? Yeah.
Well, I've always, for a long time, I've had the impression of having two separate lives, because when I was in my 20s, I would play, as you said, in a punk rock band, but I was also studying literature at the university. And back then, the university was way more rigid than it is today. So these two identities could not really coexist. And I actually liked the fact of being on one side, very intellectual, rigorous, and on the other, just being totally crazy. And when, after much studying, I ended up being a professor, when you start in the career, it's a lot of work, and it sort of became my only reality. And after a while, I felt I was sort of choking in it, j'étouffais. And it was, I don't know, I did not see myself just starting playing in rock bands again. That was done with. But writing sort of gave me back that double identity. So, of course, since I teach in the literature department, it's way more unified than it used to be, but I still have this little, I don't know, personal space, which I really enjoy. But to follow up on what Norm was saying, I cannot write fiction and teach and write criticism at the same time. My fictional work was always written in a sabbatical, and then I reworked the drafts during the summer. You really have to be in a whole other headspace to be able to do that.
And when you say headspace, is it also physical space? Like, do you physically need to be away from the university, away from Montreal, outside of your regular life, or is it just carving space within it?
No. I mean, I'm really not the type to travel to write, because if I'm somewhere else, I'm going to want to visit and not write. So I mean, I write like in my kitchen, basically. But yeah, I have to block everything out to be able to concentrate. But that's really my own little quirks.
Great, thank you. Liz?
It's a great question. I think finding the balance in our lives between our intellectual pursuits, our creative pursuits, the diverse creative pursuits that we have is always a challenge. When I began working at Concordia, I was working on a feature film, a 60-minute documentary, and now I'm working on 2-minute audio pieces. So I think that I have changed my making to match my obligations in the university. I also think the world has changed, so our attention spans, the attention economy, like what do we consume as media has changed. But I think it's always a tension in my life. At the best of times, that brings a lot of richness into the classroom. But I'll share a story. When I went up for tenure review, I mostly had films to present. And some of my colleagues, in my department in communication studies, we really value praxis. So I was hired as an activist documentary filmmaker, and nobody said you really ought to change who you are in order to be a member of this community. But there was a question of, what about publications? Where are they? And will you move in that direction? And it actually opened up a really wonderful opportunity for me to continue to expand what I think of my practice as cross-platform storytelling. So thinking about the academic journal as just one platform through which I can explore creative ideas, but so is my cell phone, and so is Netflix, and so are all of the different places that I kind of work through creative ideas. So it was a really good challenge at that time, and I began really by kind of thinking about who am I in conversation with around these ideas. And I just started simply trying to position my work with other makers. And it opened up a lot of opportunities for me. So it's an evolving tension and practice.
Yeah, so you brought up quite a few aspects. First of all, I guess the subtle suggestion towards a certain conformity in terms of scholarly production. So that's one aspect that you accepted to a certain point. So you started writing articles, but self-reflective articles, I assume, articles that allowed you to think through process, but also share pedagogically. So there's a generative act in that. But something that you mentioned very early on. Having basically changed the format of your work. So you went from a full-length documentary to 2-minute podcasts and VR and various modes in order to respond to the obligations of the university. What do you mean by that? Is it time-wise? Is it expected productivity over the timeline? I'm just really curious to hear about that.
Yeah, I remember at a certain moment thinking a lot of my peers in the documentary world would go and spend like 4 months in Iran or, literally be somewhere else and following a story over time. And I remember thinking, I don't think I will have that kind of time again. And there may be a way that I can continue to bring creative practice, but so that it doesn't feel like this really tug of war, but more like small iterations. And like I say, fortunately, the world was also changing, so it hasn't felt so much like a sacrifice as much as an adaptation to a changing world where not only are my obligations different, but so are attention spans, and so are the way that we digest media. So for example, a project that I'm working on right now, it's called Wastegapes, and there are at present 52-minute clips. So there's still a lot of media in there, but the whole, rather than coming up with a 100-minute piece, it's really like 50 short narrative units. And there's something liberating about that, but there's also something that really works with my new lifestyle.
Right, yeah, it's feasible, it's possible to actually produce, and they each have their own structure. This is absolutely fascinating. So you come in from an external context in which the modes of production and reception dictate to a certain extent the format and how it's going to be received. But within the university, you've got multiple possibilities, right? You can start working on different genres, working different modes. I'd like to move to the question of how, because you've broached it, how does the university, or being a professor, being in a scholarly practice, being in the classroom, how does this affect your creative output? Or does it? Perhaps it sounds like it does in your case, Liz, but maybe it doesn't in Sylvain and Norm's cases. Would you like to talk to that?
I can start.
Yeah?
So this is to some degree then a reverse from the thing I said first. I mean, the research that I do academically and the experience of teaching young people and then reading books and rereading them, of course, is feeding my, whatever my mindset is going toward in creative work. And then also the opportunity to travel to conferences and then do research when you're in those places. So certainly for me, the activities that are so central to what we do at the university and without concern with creative activity in my life are feeding interests and ideas. And then I drove my academic research towards Poland, where I also wanted to get to some more personal concerns and then also write, so that the return visits to Poland that became kind of almost reflexive, I couldn't stop, resulted both in non-fiction work and conference papers, and then to some degree the immigration book that's due out, but then this novel, the last one. So I certainly, make the website look like the other thing's not happening, but the two things are sort of, they're feeding each other, and the reading is a shared resource, and all the rest of the things that you would say.
Yeah. Thank you. And Sylvain, you've taught Siora, and your first book was titled Faire Violence.
Yeah, well, for me, the whole punk culture and literature has always been intertwined. I read L'Étranger from Camus because of the song by The Cure.
Of course.
I used to like the French punk band Berrurier Noir, and they got their name from San Antonio, which I read, and San Antonio said he got his inspiration from Céline, and thus I read Voyage au bout de la nuit. And I just sort of segged into high literature from rock. So it's always been linked, and then I did a PhD on Sioran because, as you said, there's this negativity, this nihilism, which is very close, in my sense, to the punk ethos. So it was as if I was studying the roots of all that. And then when I became a professor at a university like Concordia, I felt a little more freedom. So I wrote, of course, on literature, but I also started writing on punk rock using the analytical tools and the whole cultural horizon reference frame that I had developed for literature to speak about punk. And then I moved on studying how punk was represented in literature. And of course, I ended up with this temptation of myself writing a novel about punk rock. So, so the whole academic context, of course, is really in the background of all I do. So, so that's the whole advantage. Of course, the inconvenience is that I'm never going to be a pure novelist because I always have the urge to explain where I should be showing. So, basically, I write narrative essays. Let's not kid ourselves.
What is a pure novelist in your definition?
Someone who can communicate higher truths through image, through an intuitive way, without having to spell it out too much. And I'm well aware that I have a tendency to explain, which is not always compatible with the novel, but contemporary literature likes to explain, so I can sort of seg my way in there, and French literature particularly likes to explain, so I can still find a little niche for myself.
So you can be a true contemporary French novelist,
Voila.
living in Quebec and teaching at Concordia. And yet it's interesting because you distinguished earlier on this academic persona and pursuit, and then the more personal writing came in. And your last novel seems to me the most personal. And do you want to talk briefly about that, and we can sort of tease that out? So this came from an experience of you playing in your punk band, but 20 years later, or something. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't want to monopolize the microphone.
We'll
of my
share
novels
around.
are entirely autobiographical, but the first one I hide behind a sort of like Beckettian form, so it's quite abstract. But yeah, this one, something quite strange happened because I was professor at Concordia. I was about to apply for my full professorship, and the band in which I played between ages 18 and 28, Banlieue Rouge, which had a certain success, we were approached by this big festival, Le Rockfest in Montebello, which specializes in reforming old punk bands, and it's huge. So at first we didn't know, and finally we said, okay, fine, we'll do it just for one show. So we were all 45. We had never lost contact, but we were never as close as we were back then. And we, on a répété, we jammed for a few months, and we did the show. It was the largest show we ever played, which is the weird thing about nostalgia and popular culture. And all that was really strange because even though I was studying punk rock, I didn't really hang out in punk bars or anything anymore. I felt I was just like out of the culture. But when I got in that festival, it was just nostalgia for punk rock. So I knew all the bands, I knew all the references. It was extremely strange for me. And at the same time, it's like if I fitted perfectly, but since I had been in academia for a few years, at the same time I was a complete stranger. So it was very, very weird. And I wanted to write about it, and not in an essayistic form, because I would be the snob intellectual or the purist, and it wouldn't have been right. So a novel and hiding behind fictional characters, which are all more crazy one than the other, it was fine for me to just say all that, yeah.
Yeah. And this is what the last novel is basically about and presenting. And
the plot is about an old punk, whose name closely resembles mine, who sacrificed everything to the punk movement. He's a very intellectual and intense punk, and he sees that the singer for the band which he idolized in his youth is now making a huge comeback to make money, and he's really pissed off at that, so he goes to the festival to kill him. Very subtle, as you can see.
Yeah. Thank you. There's so many places we can go with that. But Liz, you just before the conversation officially started, I overheard you talking about the fact that you're gaining confidence in sort of investing yourself and becoming more intimate with your documentary filmmaking. Could you talk a bit about that? The place of the creator, the thinker, the teacher in documentary filmmaking, because usually we're looking from the outside, right, and we're trying to frame this as objectively as we can. But this is shifted.
Yeah, I mean, I also just want to sort of follow up on this idea of when we take risks to insert our own narratives into our work, and that tension between fiction and reality, I think, is like another thing that kind of swims across each of our practices. But so I came of age as a documentary filmmaker as an activist, and my initial orientation was that the story was outside of myself. I was studying in Peru. There were lots of social movements around me, and it was more important to be part of something bigger than myself than to focus on myself. As I learned about, for example, feminist filmmaking, I learned that integrating ourselves through self-reflexivity was an important part of politics, but it still was hard for me. And when I started my MFA, a professor looked at me and said, "You've done a beautiful job making documentaries around the world, but where are you in these films. And so that's when I did this horrifying project that I called Moles, which was a interactive online documentary made in 1999, so it was one of the first. And if you clicked on there were photographs, black and white photographs of me, and if you clicked on one of the moles, you got a story. And so that was a kind of exploration at the time in 1999 when we were beginning to understand the World Wide Web, and I was trying to figure out how confessional might we be in this online space. I had no idea who would see it, how it would circulate, and I revisited that project 20 years later, so it's also kind of similar about when we revisit projects. And I revisited that project of moles, this time using augmented reality as a way of thinking about how my narrative, in 1999, my narrative was about touch and intimacy and this new space of the World Wide Web and how intimate we could get. But in 2 years ago, I was actually thinking about aging and the moles on my body, and my father had skin cancer. And so I brought a whole other level of personal disclosure. But I've always been wary of how to balance personal disclosure with great stories. And I gave myself back then, and I gave myself today, a kind of parameter of 25%. Like 75% true, 25% fiction. And I use that in the classroom. I have an exercise that's called 75% true. And so it's a personal film that students have to make in their second level of filmmaking, and they have to, completely influenced by my own tortured experience of telling my own story. And they have to start with something personal, but then they have the parameters to adapt it. And it opens up these unbelievable conversations about what is truth, what is memory, what is art, what are the aesthetics of our past, of our present. So it's a really fun prompt, and for me, it gave me the courage to say I can find myself in my political activism and in my artistic pursuits.
Thank you for that. It actually brings up another question, that of, I guess, what your creative work brings to the classroom or graduate supervision, if that's the case. Norm, would you like to talk about that? How does your writing inform your work as a teacher and a supervisor?
So that is a neat one, and probably one I don't think about as concretely as I might. But I think part of it might be associated with voice, so that developing yourself and your work in different directions leads you to work on voice in different ways. And so the problem of getting away from the academic voice in order to write effective fiction. And it may be that the voice that you are able to bring to the class also is varied by that work and that experience and that goal. And I don't know if students would recognize that, or if they do, but they wouldn't quite know what's going on. But certainly when I'm teaching literature, probably the voice is on some kind of personal level that they might not otherwise, or in a rare case, encounter.
Right.
Maybe in the creative writing department. So that I think of voice as a kind of an underlying challenge and something to be clear about, but then also in class, something that can be offered and sort of may provide some alternative way of teaching.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sylvain?
Well, of course, writing novels while teaching literature gives you a whole other perspective on what you're teaching.
Yes.
When you've studied literature, like in a more classic sense, I mean, I studied in the past century, and when you start teaching and you're a little unsure of yourself, well, you go for the vast meaning, the vast interpretations. But after you've written a novel yourself, you see it more as something that was built as a project, and ça démystifie. I'm not even going to try to say it in English. And you see more the imperfections. You actually see things that you would have done otherwise. So it's quite interesting, because you start talking in class more of how you go from one scene to the next, how you expose a necessary plot element through dialogue, through suggestion, whatever. And it also opens you to play more with the text. It's fun in class, just say, okay, what happens if you just rewrite the opening of the novel in other verbal tense, with another type of language, more oral, more elegant, and all the stylistic choices that create the universe, you can sort of put them forward just by changing the form itself. So in that sense, having written fiction gives me, in a way, the freedom to play with the text that I teach way more than I used to. It also brings the text down to a little more to their level, and a lot of them also want to write or wants to produce media content. So just thinking about a story not as here is this big cultural object which we must interpret in terms of symbolicism, imaginary and everything, just see, okay, this scene is not important, but why is it necessary? Why do we need to go here just to go from A to C? Why was B required? And of course, then you're speculating. I mean, when I studied, we weren't really supposed to speculate on the intentions of the author. I still won't do it for like biographical things, or why did he choose that he or she chose to go for whatever subjects. But for the construction, you can still guess why was this required, and it's really interesting. And I think the students like it because it makes everything more accessible. It opens up to how they themselves could produce something similar.
Right, so you're in the depth of the author context, but you're still interested in authorship and process. Speaking of which, what drives you? What drives you to write? What drives you to work on experimental forms, on augmented reality, documentary? We're in a position where we could just write our scholarly papers and that'd be fine. But what is that extra thing that gets you up in the morning and go, yeah, I need to write those 200 pages. I need to, overtime obviously, I need to produce this video.
I have a kind of insatiable curiosity. I was a terrible student. I just need to say that and confess that. I find it curious every day that I'm still in a learning environment. But I think that what drives me and what I love about being in an academic community is the permission to be curious, to ask questions, to learn. And then the creative process for me was a discovery as a young activist, where I felt like I wanted to make a difference in the world, but I also wanted to have fun. I wanted to be playful. I wanted to be able to fail, to make mistakes. So I wanted to somehow really find enjoyment. So for example, the project that I've been working on for the last 2 years was really a project that came out of COVID, in that I was meant to be traveling to another place to make a virtual reality of indigenous communities losing their land to sea level rise. And instead, I was at home and desperate to get out of the house. And so was my partner, desperate for me to get out of the house. And so I was going to teach a class. And it was with MJ Thompson, and it was meant to be a spectacle. It was going to be a class in the form of a cycling tour, where we were going to cycle through the city and visit waste-scapes, like waste sites, with a very open, expansive concept of what is waste in our lives, from architecture to toxic water. And because of COVID, that class became a self-driven pathways through the city, and then turned into this augmented app. But it gave me permission to kind of explore and learn about our city with this lens of waste, with this kind of conceptual framework, but really like looking around, learning and observing. And it really got me through the last 2 years. But it also permitted me to kind of just ask questions and seek out answers. And I think that's, you know, the gift of the documentary maker is that my projects shift every 3 to 5 years, so I can take on a kind of different approach and angle, and dig in, and then really try to think about how do I story this? Like, where's the story here, and how do I find a way to communicate really complex issues in ways that invite people into that conversation?
Sylvain, what drives you?
I'm left out of this one. It's for me, very hard one to answer. I can't answer it in any kind of concrete, appropriate way. It would require therapy. The earliest decisions as to what you'll be are the things I start to think about as I listen to the question, and the models whom I had at the time were storytellers. And they're gone, but somehow their model stayed with me. And they were so good and so fascinating to hear that I guess I picked up the urge, though I'm not myself a storyteller in the way that they are, rather became a writer. And then the mindset that allows for that kind of creative instinct or return just gets embedded in some way, and it is it gets suppressed, and it rises up, and then you'll start to worry, maybe it's gone. These are things you hear from all kinds of different creative people, and then it does eventually reappear and insists that the idea that you've been avoiding ought to be sketched out, and then you proceed from there. Yeah.
You mentioned that you're not a storyteller.
Not an oral kind of storyteller.
Can you talk about, I guess, what you mean by a storyteller in this context? Because I'm hearing an idealization of these storytellers.
Yeah.
What do they mean to you?
Well, people who so naturally, without any kind of ambition or professional goal, have stories in them that they will return to if you're patient. So I had that kind of patience when I was young too. So I'm thinking in one case of my mom's mom. So she had a life before Canada, which was Poland, and she would retell it, and she would return to it, and she would in some ways inhabit it while telling it. So this was a remarkable kind of offering that she was constantly ready for, and we had the right kind of pace together, and I sort of followed her. So I think I had the right kind of instincts and interests, and yet then arriving at that kind of a model kind of forces the idea of fiction, of telling, of recovery, and then it's this oddball thing that some of it that you're going to use is actual, and then some of it is going to be refashioned because the way it's operating on its own terms kind of doesn't quite arrive or something.
I guess there's a certain responsibility also. These are family stories.
Well, of course, in my case, you're right. I'm mostly out of them now. I had a real good selection, and with the immigration story that I'm just finishing up with, I think I've used them all. I think they're gone.
Well, we'll see. Thank you. Sylvain?
Well, I don't see myself either as a natural storyteller. In fact, those who know me will laugh. My natural way of being is to be extremely quiet, extremely attentive, overanalyze everything, which gives me, I think, a certain insight on what goes on around me. I end up understanding in my own way a number of things, and then sometimes that has to come out. For a while, it came out in scholarly publications, which were a lot more autobiographical than people realized. I opened up a wide spectrum in the genre. I mean, I could be either very mythological with a million references, or being really essayistic and, just sort of surfing along. So fiction just opened up another way of exploring these things. But it's not necessarily to tell a story. It's to try to explain something about existence in general that I feel I've understood and which I want to communicate. And then you have to find the most appropriate avenue to be able to just tell this. And narrative gives possibilities that scholarly work, an essay does not have. So it's just, for me, an extra tool. So I don't really, I don't have the pressure to keep on having a literary oeuvre, you know. I might keep on going, but I might also just write a scholarly book. I don't know. So it will depend on my interests of the moment. So for me, it's really like holistic. It's like a whole spectrum of possibilities.
A whole spectrum of possibilities. And you mentioned earlier fiction allows you to explore things that you otherwise wouldn't have necessarily explored in the same way in academic work. I'd like to thank all three of you for sharing these insights. And, we went beyond the surface. We started scratching at some fundamental aspects in your position within the university, but also self-reflection on your creative process and how this feeds into your academic work and vice versa. I'm told that we've run out of time, so we won't have questions. I'm sorry. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.